Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's EBC video. We're at the highest point in Scott County. It's called Pete's Hill Park, and we're here to think about John 17, 1 through 11. It's one of those passages where Jesus is praying. And so as we're standing here at this highest point, let's think a little bit about what we know about the ways that we see Jesus praying in the Bible. Sometimes Jesus is praying in a garden. He goes off by himself. Sometimes he's actually in a spot where he brings a few disciples with him. Sometimes he actually prays on a hilltop, and that's why we're here on the hilltop today, thinking about that. You know, this happens to be about 1,200 feet above sea level. I know that my house is about 1,024 feet above sea level, and I'm thinking for just a moment about why would it be important to come to a hilltop to pray? Is it because I feel like I'm 176 feet closer to God when I'm on the hilltop? I don't think so. I don't think that's the point at all, right? There are some moments in the Bible where Jesus is praying, and he's praying in particular as part of bringing us with him, teaching us in those prayers. There's actually even a spot earlier in John where Jesus is praying and he says, "Thank you, God, for hearing me. I know you always hear me, but I've said that so that everyone else will know that you always hear me." It's Jesus using that prayer to teach. And that is part of what he's doing here in John 17 as well. The disciples are with him, and he's just been through a lot of his teaching. And then when he's done with that teaching, he begins a prayer to God. And Jesus lifts his eyes to the heavens, a real demonstrative moment where now we know he's praying. And the first thing he does is he says, "God, glorify me so that I may glorify you." And he's talking there, of course, about the fact that he's just about now to his crucifixion and resurrection. And he's talking about God helping him in that process. And then he turns his attention to the disciples. And one of the things that he says is that he prays to God saying, "These disciples have kept my word, have kept your word, God." And in saying that, I think that's a really amazing thing. If you can picture that for a moment, imagine Jesus praying for us and interceding to God on our behalf and saying, "Here's someone who has kept the word." And it's just an amazing moment, right? But it's even more amazing than that, because what we don't have in John 17 is what had happened just before that in John 16. In John 16, Jesus is spending some time talking as plainly as he's ever going to talk to the disciples about the fact that Jesus is going to die. And that's a part of the plan, but that Jesus is sent here from God. And the disciples respond in John 16 in a way that they very rarely do, because we see lots of moments where the disciples are still confused and they don't quite get it. But in this moment in John 16, the disciples say, "We believe, we understand that you're from God." And Jesus responds, we're still in John 16 for a moment, with something that's sort of both good and then feels a little bad. Because first he says, "You believe now." But then he says, "The time is at hand where you won't believe." And I think he's talking about the fact that when Jesus is crucified, we know that, for instance, Peter is going to reject him 3 times. We know that Jesus is saying to the disciples, "I know what's going to happen. There's still going to be doubts. There's still going to be failures." But remember, it's still then right after that Jesus is making a great big point of saying, "I'm praying for the disciples, and these are people who are keeping my word." It's a fantastic message for us too, to know that even though we're going to fail from time to time, that when we've got it in our hearts to believe in Jesus and we've got it in our hearts to keep his word, Jesus is still there for us, even in our failures, trying to make sure that he's saying to God, "Be with them." And he ends this prayer for the disciples by saying, "Protect them." And it's not just sort of the keep them from harm sort of protection. It's Jesus actually says, "Protect them so that they may be one with you the way I'm one with you." And that's just a wow prayer, right? It's Jesus saying, "God, you and I have been doing this together, and we're one. I want for my disciples that they could be one with you as well." And there's a really fantastic piece of the end of John 17, which is that we know that as Jesus is talking about disciples, he's not just talking in the year 0 BCE or 32 BCE or really close in time to Jesus. He's talking about all of us too. He's talking about us being able to be one with God because Jesus has prayed for us to be able to do that, to do the great deeds in the world that Jesus was doing in the world. So everyone, have a great week with a ton of confidence, not just that Jesus is with you, but Jesus is praying for you to be one with God.